Hi, my name is Samuel Dominy, and this is Church Policies on Idolatry. To begin by looking at the writings against idolatry, this begins with the Ten Commandments of the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, which were carried down by Moses. And these strictly forbid, the practice of idol worship or idolatry in any Abrahamic tradition, and is especially carried on by policies throughout the Christian church's history. Early apologists like Justin the Martyr, who wrote the dialogue with Trypho, examines how idolatry doesn't fit within the Christian context, condemning it as being a practice that is it's unchristian. It's not a Christian thing to do. Later on, Augustine of Hippo's work, The Contra Faustum, criticized the Manichaean practices and specifically the idol worship that they had in their practices, which was very specific to the cosmos and space and celestial bodies. And finally, we'll cover the ecclesiastical history of the English people, written by the Venerable Bede, which utilizes Gregory I's letters to the missionaries in the British Isles on how to handle idol worship within the Celtic culture. So, beginning with foundations, when any religion is becoming institutional and they're expanding and having a large grasp on a large territory, the need to have a universal doctrine is understated. They have to have a strong universal doctrine which is going to bring everybody together and make the same practices. So ensuring that the entire institution is on the same side of an argument is imperative for maintaining this stable community and religious hierarchy. It's really how they can rope in the religion itself with the community there. It's a great way of combining and merging the cultures. And these images, they date so far back. It's very difficult to see a start with idol worship. In fact, even in the book of Exodus, when Moses is carrying down the commandments, he finds that the Hebrews that he's been leading out of Egyptian slavery have constructed a monument to this bull god that they're worshiping, and he uh, he explains to them how this is forbidden by the new commandments, and discusses how they're forbidden because it's a way of distinguishing themselves from these polytheistic groups. There is one God, and according to this commandment, you're only supposed to praise this single God, and these idols are it's false worship. So that's where we kind of get into Justin the Martyr, who writes his dialogue with Trypho. And these commandments on idol worship he finds to be the worship of false gods. And examining it in that sense appeals to how it can definitely not be a Christian thing, let alone be a monotheistic thing. It cannot be a monotheist practice because it is worshiping more than one God, because by their theology, this Christian God cannot be channeled into an idol. So these commandments are being used to argue against idol worship. They're saying and stating that idol worship is not something that theologically fits within the Christian doctrine. But with this diverse range of Christian groups in late antiquity, it was very difficult to grasp that. It was very difficult for them to hold on to a single doctrine because they were scattered, they were diverse, and it's not until Christianity becomes adopted by the Roman Empire that it starts to get stronger. But even with that, it really isn't until the two churches get stronger and network gets stronger and you have more Christian kingdoms and a larger group of Christians that you can really definitively strike down and condemn any heretical practice. So that's where Justin the Martyr really kicked off with that. He was around literally not even an entire century after Jesus had been crucified. So it's not that long after that he's working to preserve the Christian doctrine according to the Bible, which since the Bible wasn't very accessible at the time and had been widely translated or circulated, it's also very difficult for other people to practice it correctly if they don't know what it is that they're practicing wrong. And that's where Justin the Martyr and a lot of other early Christian apologists come in to try to address this issue. They're trying to correct these heresies and stop them from becoming a greater issue. And he's trying to universalize a doctrine. So that's where he gets questioned in the Dialogue of Trypho, where Trypho questions him about Christians who, quote, eat meats offered to idols and declare that they are by no means injured in consequence, end quote. Which to this, Justin answers, because this was a common practice for a lot of ancient civilizations, donating or giving these and sacrificing these meats and coins and certain objects to idols for praise. And Justin answered to this by saying, quote, there are such men confessing themselves to be Christians and admitting the crucified Jesus to be both Lord and Christ, yet not teaching his doctrines, but those of the spirits of error, end quote. Which Justin's arguing here that it's not something to where it's a false practice, but it just isn't a Christian practice at all. It's something that cannot fit within the doctrine. And doing so shows that you don't understand the Christian doctrine and that you cannot be properly practicing it if you're using idol worship. So that's Justin the Martyr finds idol worship to be an inherent lack of basic Christian knowledge. And arguing that they're not Christian or having malicious intent to teach this false form, he appeals to the commandments by showing that that's the theological basis for this. This foundation that idol worship is strictly forbidden to be an Abrahamic practice because of how it's stated in the commandments shows that doing so is to completely disregard the Ten Commandments themselves. And this precedent is set that idol worship is not accepted by God, and rather is a form of worshiping false gods. This is something that was done by polytheists. So doing so shows that you're more of a polytheist rather than praising one single God. And as the empire begins to decline, again, I mean, it's marked by this multitude of religions where putting out these writings is really focused on gaining traction and preserving the Christian doctrine that they have. Later on, this becomes an argument that Augustine of Hippo, or better known as St. Augustine, carries on. In his argument against the Manichaeans, he writes about how they praise the cosmos. He writes about how they have these stories and these fables about the sun and the stars. He says, quote, constructing fables out of the heavens, the stars, the sun, and the moon struck Augustine as far worse than poetic literary fictions, according to Miller. Isaac Miller said that this was an issue because practicing this worship of these celestial bodies was an inherent lack of Christian knowledge as well. It went against what they taught because following these cosmic things is praising things the wrong way. And Augustine himself said that, quote, it was a way of worshiping in a wrong way, and the Manichaeans do not properly worship the sun, end quote. So this logic implies that the worship of objects as being deified beings themselves is the heresy. So they can praise things like the sun as being creations of God. They can praise the heavens and other celestial bodies as being these glorious creations of the Lord and praising them in that sense. But what they're doing here instead is they're praising them as the gods themselves. And so that's an issue for Augustine that needs to be cleared up. And the Manichaeans certainly are condemned, and they're run out, and they end up being conquered much later on as the Christian church grows larger. And this this same issue is also questioned later on with Celtic Christianity. And as they begin to move northward to the British Isles and begin converting the Celts of the British Isles, because they were praising trees and they were praising certain objects that they were creating. And so as the Christianity arrives in the British Isles, the Roman Church is moving there to expand its territory. And it really occurs not so much at the beginning out of a full purpose, but monks going and seeking out the so-called edge of the world. They're seeking ascetic lifestyles, but then as the 5th and 6th centuries carry on, monasteries begin to appear, and these monasteries begin to form relations. They're forming open relationships with Ireland and England and Scotland, and they're becoming a part of the people's lives. And they're bringing that Christian influence into their lives and making it a significant part of their culture. So that's where we begin to see this sort of syncretic style of life in which some of them are adopting Christianity and they're weaving it and merging it with their own cultures. So it's this odd merge of the cultures where they're praising their Celtic gods and their ideas along with the Christian God, which over time the monasteries and the monastic missions begin to kind of push them towards using these idols in a sense that is Christian rather than praising multiple gods, which of course is something we can see with Pope Gregory I and Celtic Christianity. So with the rise of the Celtic Church, Pope Gregory I is starting to create and have missionaries establish these ecclesiastical hierarchy within the British Isles themselves. And this is where Bede's history is incredibly significant. He presents us with the letters of Pope Gregory I in discussion with Bishop Augustus, who was leading the missionary over there. And between these questions of how do they approach the Celts? How do they approach them and get them to convert without having to completely destroy their lifestyles? Which Gregory I answers by advising them to not get rid or destroy these idols, but instead to accept them to bless them as items for conduits through which they can praise God, rather than destroying them and getting rid of them entirely, because it's still a part of their culture. So this kind of becomes the practice that they do. This is what they start to do to both protect and preserve the Celtic culture, but also convert them to a Christian culture. But this didn't go without his condemnation, because of course Gregory I includes his thoughts on their idol worship, but instead of going with what the others had said, with what had Augustine of Hippo and Justin the Martyr says, Gregory I specifically calls this praising Satan. It's no longer, in the eyes of the church, a praise of false gods, but rather specifically Satan. And while, of course, Christianity rejects the idea of dualism because it is entirely monotheistic, it still kind of holds this idea of good versus evil, where it is God versus Satan, even though Satan is not an equal to God. But still, he's condemning it for this praise of Satan, which he views to be it's an evil. It's something evil that they're doing. And so he's not condemning the Celts themselves or telling them that they're evil, but instead he's redirecting them in a better way that's going to be nicer for the transition to Christianity. And this compares quite significantly with missions like that of Boniface, because Boniface, who was in Saxony a few decades after Gregory I, his papacy, Boniface has a very different approach. He starts this much more aggressive style of approaching them, in which he cuts down important trees to Saxon Celts. He's really going in there and having a much more aggressive approach in which he's forcibly making them convert. And it shows it has very big difference in that there's a lot more of a tumultuous climate in Saxony as a result. They have a much more difficult time in converting because it's not as nice of an approach. And so the policy remains the same. This syncretism begins to merge, but this policy against idolatry continues. It stays strong. And Justin the Martyr and Augustine, they condemned it for being this praise of false gods, but it begins to change to where Christianity is the main practice. The polytheists are really starting to die out, and so it's an argument against praising Satan. So this policy begins to change. It's evolving over time and condemning idolatry, but for different reasons. But regardless, what we find at the end of the day is that idol worship is still completely forbidden. It is forbidden from the very foundations of the Ten Commandments and continues to be forbidden forever. Even if you go into a book on catechism, you will find very strict definitions against idolatry. And that is a furthering of this seemingly eternal policy against idolatry. Thank you.